All right, let's call the meeting to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'm glad you weren't deterred by the rain, and it's really wonderful to see everyone. Hello?
Everybody, please keep
Hi,
it down.
Peter, please, we've started the meeting. All right, our next meeting will be January 7th with Phelan McAleer. He's the Irish filmmaker who has done many films on conservative themes such as the abortion issue, the doctors who were performing botched abortions, and his latest is not a film but a play about October 7th. He went to Israel and interviewed people and interviewed the victims and released hostages, and wrote this play called In Their Own Words. So it's like the verbatim words of the people, and so he will be here to talk about his work, I guess his experience in Israel. So that's Tuesday, January 7th, to start the new year. Our announcements, now that the election is passed, are a little bit fewer. But our main announcement, as always, is to please renew your membership or join. Every penny that we take in goes for rent and cookies and water and coffee for presenting these meetings. All of us are volunteers, which we could use more of also. And no one takes any money. No one... and our speakers are not paid, and so we are really fortunate to have wonderful speakers. And the only thing that we sometimes that we do, and as tonight, is we have a book signing, and it's really appreciated if everybody considers purchasing a book, because that helps us continue to get good speakers. And so tonight, we do have, I'll be mentioning it again later, but there is a book signing going on right now. Some of you have already been very generous, and I think they would make great Hanukkah and Christmas presents. So also, as I said, we need volunteers. We need particularly people to help with the website, with emails. We have people working on this now, but it's really, sometimes it gets to be a lot for one person to handle, and sometimes people are away or get sick, and we need backup. So if anyone can help us out with that, that would be appreciated. Also, we can always use more phone callers for the meetings so that our present phone callers can make fewer phone calls. All right. So it is a real honor and a privilege to host Gordon Chang tonight. I think it's the 5th time he's been here, which is extraordinary, not because of the number, but because every time Gordon addresses us, he's more brilliant than the time before. Gordon is our nation's foremost and most formidable Asia analyst, having parlayed a law degree and life and work experiences for almost 2 decades in China and Hong Kong. Asia analyst itself is just shorthand, for his ever-growing expertise not only encompasses the nations of Asia, but also extends globally to all the countries and regions they, and particularly China, touch, including Iran, Turkey, Israel, Russia, and South America. He is here tonight to comment on and also sign his just-released book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. And you can get a book signed after the meeting. So his book is Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. That's China's plan to destroy the society of an unprepared America. An alarm he has been sounding for some time, including with his 2023 book, China is Going to War. But surely, we also can expect some comments on South Korea's aborted martial law attempt. For Gordon continues to be up to date on all matters Asia, providing almost constant running commentary on X and other outlets, and contributing to Fox News, Fox Business, MSN, The Hill, and Newsweek, among others. He still is all around the radio dial. I particularly look forward to hearing him co-host John Batchelor's Eye on the World program. His energy is remarkable, and therefore we are all the more honored that he and his gracious wife Lydia always find time for us. It is my great pleasure to welcome back our good friend, Gordon Chang.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you all for coming here on a rainy evening, so I very much appreciate it. China has a project to destroy America. In May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, carried a landmark editorial that declared a quote-unquote people's war on us. In Communist Party thought, a people's war is total war. Now, a lot of Americans say, well, that's just propaganda. We don't need to listen to it. That's a mistake. It's a mistake because China, with its strident anti-Americanism, is establishing a justification to strike our country. James Lilly, who was our great ambassador to Beijing in the late 1980s, the Tiananmen Massacre, 1989, he put it this way. He said, the Chinese always telegraph their punches. The Communist Party views the United States as an existential threat. It views us as an existential threat, not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are. An insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of America's values and form of governance on the Chinese people, which means we will never have amicable relations with China as long as the Communist Party rules it. That also means there's only going to be one survivor. It's either going to be the People's Republic of China or the United States of America, not both. Is China really that hostile? Quarter century ago, China's General Chen Tung, the defense minister, reportedly gave a secret speech where he advocated the extermination of the American people. His plan was to use disease to clear out the hills, valleys, and plains of North America so that the Chinese could settle into the vast spaces that were uninhabited. Quote, "It is indeed brutal to kill 1 to 200 million Americans," he said. Quote, "But this is the only path to secure a Chinese century, a century in which the Communist Party leads it." When we heard of this speech in 2005, it just sounded fantastical that China would use germs, microbes, viruses to commit a genocide. Now, we have not had confirmation of this speech, so the question is, did the general actually give it? Well, since then, we've had indications that he did. And we can start with COVID. COVID-19 came from a Chinese biological weapons lab. The regime knew no later than the second week of December of 2019 that SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen that causes this disease, was highly transmissible human to human. But they told the world directly, and they told the world through the World Health Organization, that this was not contagious, that health officials around the world did not need to do anything. The second thing, Xi Jinping strictly locked down his country. Lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down China, he was telling the world that he thought this was an effective way to stop disease. So while the Chinese were locking down their own country, they were pressuring others, including the United States, to take arrivals from China without travel restrictions or quarantines. And that's how this disease, which should have been confined to China, actually spread around the world. That's 7 million people outside China died from COVID, including 1.2 million Americans. 1.2 million Americans didn't just die, they were murdered. This was the deliberate taking of life without justification. Why do we talk about this? Well, because it shows that the Chinese regime has the maliciousness that General Chur-Hao-Tun exhibited when he gave his speech. And it shows that the Communist Party of China is capable of unfathomable evil. Another hint that this speech was actually given. We know that in China's tightly controlled public square, that the talk of the extermination of the American people is a permitted topic. But we now have to be concerned with more than just words, because we know that at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and at other locations throughout China, that Chinese technicians are working on what they call, quote, specific ethnic genetic attacks. In other words, attacks that will hit only a specific ethnic group. So the next disease from China won't be like COVID-19, which got everybody. It could very well leave the Chinese immune, but sicken and kill everybody else. So the next disease from China is coming, or it's already here. An alert building inspector in Reedley, California, that's near Fresno in the Central Valley, in December 2022, discovered a secret Chinese biological weapons lab on American soil. Inside, researchers found at least 20 pathogens, including the one for Ebola, and almost 1,000 mice that had been genetically engineered to spread disease. Ebola, natural state, 50% fatality rate. Good thing about Ebola, however, is that it is not readily contagious. But we know that at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that researchers are studying Ebola, which means they are weaponizing Ebola. And that means if they can increase the lethality, or more important, if they can increase its transmissibility, then the Chinese will have the weapon that General Chur-Hao-Tun talked about. But disease is not the only attack from China on America. There is fentanyl. Xi Jinping is deliberately killing 70 to 75,000 Americans a year with this deadly opioid. Now, on November 15th of last year, Xi Jinping met Joe Biden in Woodside, California. On the following day, Biden proudly told the American people that the Chinese had agreed that they would limit the sale of fentanyl precursors and pill presses that had been sold across the Pacific Ocean to the Western Hemisphere. And Biden said, "Oh, this is a great victory." Well, that same Xi Jinping made essentially the same promise to President Trump in 2018 and to President Obama in 2016. And of course, he violated all of them because fentanyl is an integral part of his plan to weaken the United States. Now, fentanyl precursors, they come across the Pacific. Mexican cartels, with the help of Chinese technicians, mix them and they're smuggled across our open border. But make no mistake, This is an attack by the Communist Party of China on the United States of America. The fentanyl gangs, they are large, they are well organized, they're international in scope. They could not operate in China's near total surveillance state without the knowledge and the approval of the Communist Party. But we don't have to speculate about that. Some of the fentanyl producers are state-owned. The Chinese central government actually gives subsidies for the production of fentanyl. Chinese diplomats give cover to the fentanyl gangs. Every container that leaves China is inspected by officials, and the Chinese gangs that make fentanyl, they launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. Ever heard of TikTok? Chinese own TikTok, which the regime uses to propagate its narratives. Chinese own TikTok promotes illicit drug use in the United States. So, these are 70 to 75,000 Americans, again, people who are murdered. One other attack we should talk about tonight, and that is the Chinese coming into our country across the southern border. 2 years ago, most of the Chinese who were coming across the Rio Grande, they were middle class. They were desperate to live in a free society. Now, U.S. Border Patrol sees a difference in the composition of the Chinese migrants. Now, at least 2/3, and at some border crossings, 85% of the Chinese migrants are single males of military age, traveling without family members, some of them pretending not to speak English, and U.S. Border Patrol knows that some of them have links to the Chinese military. And now, it's not just our southern border. In February, Border Patrol apprehended 3 Chinese migrants trying to sneak into Maine. They arrested a 4th Chinese national on our side of the border who was obviously there by prearrangement to help them get in. If you want to live in a free society, you give yourself up to Border Patrol. You run to the Border Patrol because, among other things, you want a free hotel room in the city of New York. But if you're coming into this country and you try to remain undetected, it means you are coming here for no good. And what we are seeing as an increased tempo, as Chinese migrants come into our country, we're seeing an increased tempo of Chinese nationals trying to sneak into our military bases. So for instance, in September, guards caught a Chinese national twice trying to sneak into a U.S. nuclear weapons facility. Just a few hours ago, they apprehended a Chinese national who was flying a drone over Vandenberg Space Force Base. So these incidents occur weekly. These are people trying to sneak into our bases, trying to get in without proper authorization or documentation. People who are just trying to surveil our bases. And there's large drone incursions over our Air Force bases. And they've been occurring with frequency. These are not the work of hobbyists. Just a few hours ago, I actually saw a video of a drone, unidentified, over the development in which I live in Bedminster, New Jersey.
It's a mic drop.
It's a mic drop. That's right. So these disturbing developments are occurring at the same time that Xi Jinping is waging proxy wars on the world. He's got 3 of them now. There's Ukraine, that's Europe. There is across northern Africa, and the one that we know about, October 7th. China is behind Iran. The Iranians don't think they're a proxy of anybody, the Chinese do. And then of course, the Iranians have their proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi militia. China is behind this. July 23rd, 14 Palestinian groups show up in Beijing and sign what's called the Beijing Declaration. This was China's attempt to try to make Hamas the leader of the Palestinians. Fortunately, it failed. So the question is, what's up with Xi Jinping's war everywhere strategy? Because it's not just the 3 proxy wars. He's now trying, looks like, to start a war in East Asia. This just does not look good. So what the hell is he doing? Well, I think that Xi Jinping, who reveres Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic, I think that Xi Jinping has taken 2 pages out of Mao's peasant movement playbook. First page. In 1949, Mao prevailed over his enemy, Chiang Kai-shek, by, quote, encircling the cities from the countryside. It appears that Xi Jinping views Ukraine, Israel, North Africa as countryside, and the United States is the city. The second page involves the fomenting of chaos. Quote, great chaos under heaven achieves great order under heaven. Those words were written by Mao in 1966 to his wife, Chang. Great order under heaven is Chinese code for worldwide Chinese rule. That's not Chinese control. That's not Chinese dominion or domination. That's not China exerting hegemony. That's direct Chinese rule Mao was talking about. So Xi Jinping is destroying societies, killing people around the world because he views that as an intermediary step towards his complete control of humanity. And Xi Jinping is now thinking of starting a war himself. He can't stop talking about it. He talks about it all the time. His favorite slogan is "Dare to fight." That message is filtering down to the Chinese military, and they tell us they are ready to fight. But it's more than just words. So, for instance, Xi is involved in the biggest military buildup since the Second World War. He's trying to sanction-proof his regime. He is stockpiling grain and other commodities. He's firing military officers who are opposed to going to war. He's surveying the U.S. for nuclear weapon strikes. By the way, that was what that rather large object that floated over our country in January and February last year. It was looking at nuclear weapon sites in the United States. And Xi Jinping is mobilizing China's civilians for war. He's calling up reservists. Financial Times recently wrote about how Chinese state enterprises are standing up militia units in their organizations. We don't know if Xi Jinping has made the decision to go to war, but we do know this. We know that he has made the decision to risk war. He has made the decision to risk war with U.S. treaty allies. In other words, countries which we have a treaty obligation to defend. And that means Xi Jinping has already made the decision to risk war with the United States. And to put that another way, he has made the decision already to kill Americans. I think he's a little bit desperate. Got to remember the context of the Chinese political system right now. When Xi Jinping became China's ruler in late 2012, he inherited a consensual political system. That's a system where no leader got too much credit or too much blame because every decision of consequence was made by consensus at the top of the Chinese political system. That's the Politburo Standing Committee. Now, Xi Jinping has taken power from most everybody else, which means he's got nobody else to blame. To make matters worse, when Xi Jinping became China's ruler, he inherited a political system where if you got tossed out of the party or whatever, it wasn't too bad because you got a nice house in Beijing. But Xi Jinping raised the cost of losing political struggles. He did that by jailing his opponents, by stripping them of their assets, and by going really hard against their families. So here's a guy who has full responsibility for a deteriorating situation, who knows that he can lose everything. And that's why I think he can be desperate. Why he could start a war, because maybe he thinks he can rally the Chinese people, which is pretty unlikely because the Chinese people right now, the last thing they want is war. But what Xi Jinping might be doing is preventing other senior Communist Party figures from deposing him by starting a war. I'm not saying that he will do that, but I'm saying he now has a lot of incentives to do that. He is, after all, being blamed for China's simultaneous crises. He's got a crumbling economy, plunging property prices, continuing debt defaults, falling currency, accelerating capital flight, failing local governments, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, eroding demography. His solutions, quote unquote, are making matters worse. So I think Xi Jinping may be seeing a closing window of opportunity. This means Xi Jinping has almost every incentive to make his crisis our crisis. It means that he has incentives to go to war. History has called upon us to defend our country, to defend the legacy of 1776. And ladies and gentlemen, America is worth fighting for. Thank you so much. Yes, I know you want a question.
I wanted you to verify something, because when I tell people this, they don't not believe it. A lot of people, it wasn't very well covered in the news here. But can you verify whether the communist Chinese had a secret police force in Chinatown? And it was, from what I understand, during the Obama administration, it started and then it was uncovered during the Trump administration. And that people were being made to, Chinese Americans were being intimidated all off the streets and made to disappear possibly.
Yes, a couple of years ago, the FBI closed down a Chinese police station on East Broadway in this city. But the Daily Caller and the New York Post have pointed out that there may be something like 7 to 9 remaining police stations, Chinese police stations, in the US. One of them, by the way, is in Minneapolis, which is in the state of Minnesota, whose governor is
Tim Walz.
Tim Walz. Tim on Tim.
Oh, what a coincidence.
But in general, what's happened is, for decades, Chinese consular officials and Ministry of State Security agents have been operating on our soil, doing various things, some of which violate our sovereignty, some of which are just actually crimes. And unfortunately, our presidents have known about this, they've had the power to do something about it, but they've allowed the Chinese to continue this. This has got to stop.
And can I just ask one more?
Sure.
I heard reports that about 190,000 to 200,000 communist Chinese have come over our southern borders. And what I'm concerned is if they were setting up police forces in New York City then and grabbing people, Chinese Americans, and interrogating them and maybe making them disappear, that with that large number, they could still be doing the same thing.
Yeah, we don't know, we don't have a precise number, it's probably in the tens of thousands. And of those, as I said, some were just desperate middle-class Chinese. But others, they do look like they're very suspicious. And we have had these reports of Chinese nationals trying to, first of all, surveil our bases, try to intrude on our bases, do all sorts of things. So, of that number, and we don't know the precise number, but of that number, yes, there are some very dangerous elements. When war comes to East Asia, it will be fought on American soil, because these elements will, I don't know, start wildfires, bomb shopping centers, take down our grid, assassinate officials. We just don't know. But the point is, we have a lot of evidence suggesting that they are here. Another thing, it's not just the Chinese. Biden is still president of the United States, so this is something that we should talk about, and that is, remember last September 11th, Biden arranged a deal with the Iranians? And he released, some more money to them. As a part of that arrangement, he gave clemency to 5 Iranian operatives. Okay, but he allowed 3 of them to remain in the United States at a time when Iranian operatives were trying to assassinate former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other former State Department officials from the Trump era. So the Iranians are active here as well. And that means we've got a whole crew, Iranians, Venezuelans, probably some Syrians and Chinese, who are here to wage war on the United States when the time comes. Yeah, you select.
Going forward though, please, one question per person, Alice.
Yes, in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, what would you consider to be a proper American response? And should any military activity be contingent upon the participation of other nations in East Asia, such as Japan and South Korea?
Yeah, a great question. South Korea looks like it's gonna become communist soon, so we're probably not gonna get help from Seoul. But that's another story. Not a good story, no. With regard to Taiwan, it gets a little complicated. I tend to think, to answer your question, the proper response is the United States opposes the Chinese militarily. We have a lot of reasons to do that. One of them is that since the 1800s, we have drawn our Western defense perimeter off the coast of East Asia, and Taiwan sits at the center of that critical perimeter where the South China Sea and East China Sea meet. The Chinese are attacking not only our democracy, but every democracy, and we can't allow them to attack a democracy, especially one as important as Taiwan. But another thing, and that is after Biden's catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, Taiwan has become, not just in the region, but has become around the world, the test of American credibility and resolve. So we have to defend it. I think that we can prevent an invasion of Taiwan if the President of the United States would say that we will militarily defend it. Because the Chinese, even if they think they could win a war, don't want to do so for a number of reasons. I think that though a more likely target for the Chinese, Taiwan's a very hard military target. I think a more likely target would be the Philippines, maybe even Japan might be simpler for them. But clearly Xi Jinping has been very, very active since the last 3 or 4 days of November and all of this month in creating provocations. If we go, this is really, I think it's fascinating the way the Chinese think. Beginning around the first day or so of November, China went automatically just suddenly quiet in its peripheral seas and its airspace. I think that they knew what our pollsters didn't know, and that was that Trump was going to win the election. And then for about 3 weeks, the Chinese remained quiet. And I think that's because they didn't want to take Trump on. They didn't know what to do. But in the last 3 or 4 days of November and continuing through today, China has been extremely belligerent in its activities with regard to the Philippines, but also Taiwan as well. And so I think Xi Jinping believes that with the Biden administration checking out, as if it were ever here in the first place, but with the Biden administration checking out, I think that they believe that there's a vacuum and that they can exploit that. So this is a sort of a vulnerable period for us because we don't know what they're going to do. In addition to that, there is turmoil in our ally, South Korea, and the Chinese might try to take advantage of that as well. So this is one of those moments when something could occur. And they just hope that we get through to January 20, because I think then the Chinese probably will sort of slink back. But between now and then, and that's a pretty long time, I think we're in danger.
Thank you. So I once heard you on Mornings with Maria Bartiromo, and I'm paraphrasing what I once heard you say, which is that it costs China a fraction of what it costs us to build a naval ship. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, how are we going to be able to militarily compete with China if this continues? and that if this continues, China is going to dominate the world. And my question is, do you see this trend reversing, and what can Trump do to reverse this trend?
Yeah, China is building ships much faster than we are. Their shipbuilding capacity was put at 232 times greater than ours, which is just astounding, we have let our shipbuilding capacity erode. This occurred right after the Cold War. So this is our fault. The Chinese will continue to build ships at a faster pace than we will. Our ships are better, but as they say in the military, quantity has a quality of its own, which means you just build so much that you just overwhelm an opponent. The problem with China's military is, and one other thing, which is even worse, it's not just a question of numbers. China has weapons that we don't have. So, for instance, they have our hypersonic cruise missiles, which are ship killers. They have them, we don't have them. So that compounds the issue of their building ships faster. On the bright side of the ledger, the Chinese suck at fighting. They have for a very, very long time. The last time they went to war was 1979. Vietnam's third string beat their first string. They actually attacked India in June of 2020, a surprise attack, and the Chinese lost twice the number of soldiers that India did. Their navy has never really gone to war, so they don't know. The problem with the Chinese military, it's not so much their ships or their weapons, which are really quite good. The problem is it's a communist military. In a communist military, you have two reporting lines. You got a military reporting line and a political one. And of the two, the more important one is the political one. Now, the Chinese would do very well in the first week of a war because everything will be planned out. Nobody has any discretion. Everything goes according to plan. The problem for China is what happens after they achieve their initial objectives and their enemies start to counterattack. Because when you have a communist military, they are very bad at defense. And so this is going to be an important time for us. But the Chinese military right now is in a state of distress. There's purge after purge at the top of it. And Xi Jinping, for some reason or another, doesn't trust his general officers. This is a very bad situation in Beijing. So the Chinese military, it can engage in low-level provocations like it is doing in the South China Sea, but I don't think that it is now solidified enough to be able to launch a major attack. So, at least for a little while, we've got a little bit of time in which to get ourselves ready. The problem is we're not utilizing. Biden is just, as I mentioned, he's not paying attention to what China is doing. Xi Jinping, as I mentioned, talks about going to war all the time. Biden needs to talk to the American people about the dangers that are in around the world today, because it is a very, very dangerous world.
Hi.
I watched a webinar run by Frank Gaffney a week ago on Korea and learned a lot I didn't know. The largest political party there, and they call themselves Democrats, by the way, is basically extremely left-wing. They have a conservative president who tried to prevent a takeover by declaring martial law, which has been spun all over the world as, an undemocratic, illegal, but unfortunately would have been necessary. Anyway, the implication from the webinar is we're on the verge of the majority party in Korea, which, as you say, is communist, possibly merging with North Korea, and or another Korean war, and we're back in the 50s. Any comment? And of course, China is behind all of it and would probably get involved with it, as might Russia.
Yeah, President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law last Tuesday. He rescinded it after 6 hours. And he is now almost universally unpopular in Korea. Normally, the Korean population is 50-50, split between conservatives and progressives. The progressives are really leftists. But Yoon Suk Yeol has managed to unite a large portion of South Korea against him because what he did was indefensible. The problem is that just a little bit more background. Yoon very bravely and at great political cost to himself worked with the Biden administration and with Japan to build defense cooperative relations, which were in South Korea's interest. But they were really unpopular because the Japanese are really unpopular in Korea because of a terrible history. But Yoon, in his domestic politics, was a disaster, involved in scandal, completely incompetent, and now his position as president, I think is untenable. When one way or another he will leave. He will be impeached and convicted. He will be tried for treason or insurrection, which is the second way he can be removed, and third, he could step down. But his governance is untenable, which is really unfortunate. This is the problem for us because, as you point out, the Democratic Party of Korea, which is the opposition party, which will win an election in South Korea overwhelmingly, is the top element of it, not the rank and file, but the top element is communists. They're basically North Koreans. And it's going to be a very rough period. Yoon's predecessor was Moon Jae-in of the Democratic Party of Korea. We had a very tough 5 years living with the guy. We could survive another 5 years, but this is a more volatile time than the period of Moon's presidency. So I really have no sympathy for Yoon Suk Yeol for what he did, because what he did was try to take down democracy, and he had no justification for doing it. So it is a bad situation.
So Fox 5 also mentioned all the drones over New Jersey, and they made a statement that the local government doesn't have any authority, they don't know what to do, the federal government hasn't made any decision. I'm sure Biden, just like he gave billions to Iran, he's supplying China right now. And the correlation between Iran and China, there is an ideological differences. So I'm wondering, Marcia, I'm wondering, what you think is the, who's gonna really unite with them in terms of the other country, and what is this country, it's been asked before, what do you think is the best thing for Americans to do?
Yeah, let me see if I understood your question. The period today resembles 1914 in the sense that we don't know, and nobody I think really knows, if there were war, who would be fighting on whose side. And so, we just sort of assumed that China and Russia would be together because they've been together in Ukraine. But I don't know what would happen if Xi Jinping started a war in East Asia where the Russians come in on his side. North Korea is sending troops to Ukraine. There are now 4 combat brigades in Kursk, the Russian region. And so maybe the North Koreans would be, if Xi Jinping were to invade Taiwan or whatever, we don't know whether Kim Jong-un of North Korea would invade South Korea. So this is just an unmanageable situation. It's not only unmanageable, I think that it's so complex that leaders don't know and can't understand it. And that makes, in the run-up to World War I in Europe, you had these big alliances, these big powers. Nobody knew who would side with whom if something happened. And all it took was the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand to start a chain of events that was uncontrollable. I worry about today because the situation does look uncontrollable. Biden had this catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Shortly after that, Putin decides he can invade Ukraine. Then China and Russia together destabilize North Africa through insurgencies that look like wars. Then you have Iran attack Israel. That war broadens out. It becomes not just Gaza, it becomes Lebanon. Syria falls because Assad's sponsors, Iran and Russia, are weakened. God knows what's going to happen next. So this is a very, very fluid situation. And as I said, it could very well resemble what happened in the months preceding World War I in Europe. So that's where we stand right now. Did I answer your question? Okay. I wasn't quite sure.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, I recently discovered that actually the Chinese purchased like 56 or 60% of Tnuva, which is Israel's main dairy manufacturer, which was surprising to me that they would sell to the Chinese most of their holdings. And I was just wondering, for what reason are they doing that, and to what extent are they purchasing land or companies in Israel?
I agree with you. Israel should not be selling anything to the Chinese right now because China is behind Iran. Iran's behind Hamas. And Iran has made it and Iran's very close to the bomb. So to me, it's just strategically wrong for that to happen. But it's also strategically wrong for the U.S. to allow, for instance, the sale of Smithfield Foods to China. I don't know the motivation for the Chinese purchasing non-tech assets in Israel. I mean, it's clear why they're buying tech companies. But, you know, if you look at what they're doing in the food industry in the United States, is they're trying to buy, they've bought a lot of land and they're buying food processing companies. And the question is, why are they doing that here? There's a lot of motivations, but the ones that we should be focused on are the ones of the regime itself. 2 years ago, parties unknown in China started sending unsolicited seeds to Americans in all 50 states. Question is, what were the Chinese doing? I mean, you can't send something through the Chinese mail and the government and the regime not know about it. I think that what they were trying to do there is to plant invasive species in the US, because that would cripple US agriculture. So just to extrapolate a little bit, in a situation I don't know about, but I would think that if they were able to get control of, for instance, food assets in Israel, they might very well do the same thing. Got to remember that China's purchases, you know, we tend to think of Chinese companies as like American companies, but they're not, because in China's communist top-down system, no entity, no individual can disobey demand of the Communist Party. And we know that Smithfield, which was the highest profile Chinese purchase of a US food processor, we know that during COVID, that Smithfield was selling ham and meat to China under conditions where it made no sense or little sense for them to do that. It made much more sense for them to sell in our country. So they had a geopolitical motive for buying Smithfield. And so you can assume that they have geopolitical motives for purchases around the world, including those in Israel.
If President Trump calls you tomorrow morning and asks you what you would recommend as the 4 or 5 most urgent ways to deal with China today, what would you recommend?
I would recommend that he put in place the tariffs that he has talked about during the campaign. There was the 10% tariff for fentanyl, and also he talked about a minimum of a 60% across the board tariff on Chinese goods. Xi Jinping, against the advice of almost every economist and analyst and observer, has decided not to try to stimulate consumption to be the basis of the Chinese economy. Consumption accounts for something like 38 to 39% of the Chinese economy. Historically, across the world, consumption in countries accounts for 65 to 70%. In our country, it's over 70%. Because, the reason why I'm going through this is because it means that Xi Jinping has only one way to rescue the Chinese economy, and that's to export more. That means that he has put the fate of his regime in our hands, because we have the world's biggest market. If we shut that market off from him, his regime doesn't have a way of surviving. Yes, they want to sell to Europe and they want to sell to the quote-unquote global south, but Europe and the global south can't replace the American market for China, and they can't replace it quickly. The second thing that I would do is I would just say enforce U.S. law. The Tariff Act of 1930 prohibits the importation into the U.S. of goods made with forced labor. Now, almost all of China's green goods, if not all of them, are made with the forced labor of Uyghurs, ethnic minorities in China. And many of the other Chinese products, even ones that are not made by Uyghurs, are made with forced labor. They shouldn't come into the United States. And they shouldn't come into the United States if they come from a Chinese plant in Vietnam, because they're still made with forced labor. So that's the second thing that I would say. If we were to do that, we prevent a lot of Chinese stuff coming into our country. In other words, we stop supporting their military, we stop supporting their campaign of genocide, we stop their surveillance state, we stop the Communist Party. They can only attack us with our money. In other words, with our permission. So we've just got to stop this. This is strategically wrong, and this is morally wrong.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My worry is not only about China, about the entire world that China trying to control. And my question is, as New Yorkers, how can we contribute in alienating China from interference into the US government, or at least the New York City or state governance, where we have the entire New York City government installed in Chinatown? Sometimes when we have a crisis or a tragedy, one way or another, we permit it, whether with negligence or naively. So my question, as soon as we have the entire New York City government in Chinatown, there is no way we can protect ourselves. This is one. Second, we have the United Nations, and I'm a former United Nations employee for 20 years, 2 decades, in New York City and overseas. China has been buying the entire organization. It's a China organization. This is one. Second, if you want to control the world, lots of New Yorkers have no idea what's going on. If anyone wants to control, to bribe any nation, or at least to make a deal with any nation, they come to United Nations headquarters in New York City, whether badly or goodly. So, Chinese Communist Party has been bribing. The question is how. I'm coming to the question. It just allow me. Yes, Chinese Communist Party has been bribing the presidents of the United Nations General Assembly presidents. They have been bribing them for years, more than a decade. The US Federal Court in New York has been investigating this. Now, how our US government can stop China's interference while we are allowing all of this conspiracy, foreign espionage to go on without us doing anything? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer, I think, is that China has, as you say, they've been buying a lot of not only UN officials, but officials in New York City, New York State, as we know about Linda Sun, and across the US. But by the way, they do this with US dollars. And we can stop this because every US dollar transaction, except for the stuff with paper currency, you know, you go to the grocery store, you pull out a $5 bill, okay, that can happen. But every other dollar transaction clears in a bank in New York City, correspondent relations. We know that China has been engaging in corrupt activities. We know they've been laundering money through New York. We should stop it. We know about this. This is Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act. Allows us to declare a financial institution to be a primary money laundering concern. When we do that, it can no longer maintain a correspondent banking relationship in the US, which means it can no longer transact dollars anywhere in the world, which means not only in the city of New York, but in Azerbaijan. And we can do this. We know the Chinese are doing this. And we try and turn our eyes away from it. President Trump, in June 2017, declared a small Chinese bank to be a primary money laundering concern. He did that as sort of a signal to the Chinese, because it was just a small bank that really wasn't that consequential, Bank of Dandong. But the Trump administration knew that the big four, the four largest Chinese banks, the four largest banks in the world, by the way, were also money laundering. And Trump was signaling to them to stop it. But they continued on. And then, of course, Trump lost the election, so that was over with. But this is what we need to do. And by the way, in your first initial comments, you were saying, well, what can we do? Well, two things. First of all, when you buy stuff, try and buy stuff that's not made in China. And, okay, I know, it's hard. But there are websites, ladies and gentlemen, that only sell US stuff. And I know you can't do 100% non-China, but you can try a little bit. Other thing you can do, you probably have a 401k or whatever. It could very well have international mutual funds. Go to your broker and insist on ex-Hong Kong, ex-China for the stocks that are in your mutual fund. Very simple. And that is important because that's money that goes into the pockets of the Communist Party. And one other thing, and this is not really for us, but it is for the government. We know the bank accounts of senior Chinese leaders, all the corrupt money, the billions they have stuffed into our country. We should be exposing that. We should be telling the Chinese people how much Xi Jinping's bank account is. We do that, we can actually affect political change in China. And by the way, they shouldn't be laundering their money through the US. We did not allow Pablo Escobar to launder money through the United States. We should not be allowing Chinese leaders to do the same thing.
Yes, a question. Yes, a question. Hi, Gordon. It is the second time I hear you talk, and I'm very proud that we have such a wonderful speaker. Anyway, long
Tell my
story
wife
short. Thank you very much for your insight about China issue. I do have a question. When you commented over a dozen of Palestinian countries went all the way to China to make a declaration, could you comment why is that? And number two, I do understand during Mao Zedong's time, Mao Zedong has a habit of playing big brothers to all third world countries. And I think Khomeini, we thought is a terrible terrorist internally and internationally, but he somehow is a friend of Mao Zedong. And how much of that is those nostalgia feelings towards Mao Zedong's time in 50s, 60s, that China largely aided many of the third world countries, even though they tightened their own, waistline of their own people to aid those countries, including Vietnam and Cambodia and all those. But anyway, that's basically, I would like to appreciate your comment on those issues.
Okay. On the Palestinians, for a very long time, China's posture in the Middle East was a balancing role. They were trying to be friends to the Palestinians, they were friends to Israel, and they were actually quite successful. They were just there to be everybody's friend. The problem for China, though, was that Xi Jinping realized that China would never be the dominant power in the Middle East if it maintained this balancing role. So they decided that they were going to pick a side. This happened somewhat after February 2020, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went around the region and read them the Riot Act. Pompeo told countries, either you're for Iran and China, or you're for the United States, not both. We're just not going to allow you to sit on the fence. And then the result of that was the historic Abraham Accords, 4 of them, Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Morocco. So that was a real accomplishment. The Chinese saw that and they said, we want to be able to do that ourselves. In the 2020 election, Biden ran on a campaign of making Saudi Arabia a pariah. And this was over the grisly murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. That really pissed off the crown prince, as you can imagine. And that meant two things. First of all, it meant that Saudi Arabia was not going to sign the Abraham Accord agreement, which Trump had been working on. Second of all, it opened up the door for China to arrange a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which was actually put in place in March of last year. Building on that success, the Chinese thought that they could get all the Palestinians together. And the idea was, this Beijing declaration was to make Hamas the leader of the Palestinian movement. And so the Chinese were thinking they were pretty good, July 23 when they had the Beijing declaration. Then a whole bunch of crap happened to them. On the 31st of July, Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran, the bomb that went off in the Hamas guest house. And that ended up a series of events which decimated Hamas, as we know. And that meant that China's plans for elevating Hamas to the leadership of the Palestinians, in other words, to unite Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but the West Bank as well, that just completely fell apart. So, basically China right now is back to square one. Actually, it's worse than that, because what they did was they picked a side, they abandoned Israel, they picked the side of the Palestinians, and they picked the losing side. So right now, China is even further back than where they were at the beginning of this decade. On the second part, the history is that Mao looked to countries around the world, but especially in Africa, because he wanted to be the leader of the communist movement, and he wanted to make himself the number one person. And the way he saw that was, you go around to small countries because each country has one General Assembly vote, and that's what he did. So he tried to make himself the leader of what the Chinese now call the Global South. And it's not really working for a number of reasons, but that's where Xi Jinping is. He really tried to jump over and put China in the driver's seat in not only the Middle East, but elsewhere. And it looked like it was going to succeed, but unfortunately on November 5, the American people decided to end the failure of guiding foreign policy, and Trump is going to give the Chinese a hard time across the board. Because, one other last thing, you talked about the Palestinians. Trump has a great relationship with Riyadh. I think we could very well see an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. If that's indeed the case, then that really means that the United States once again is driving events in the Middle East.
I got a quick question. Can I ask a quick question? Yeah, just one quick question.
I love to talk, so you don't have to ask me.
I just have one question for you, Mr. Chang.
Yeah.
Soviet Union fell when Reagan was in office. Would you still say there's a world communist movement that's actively pursuing bringing down the West?
Well, clearly China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have tightened the bonds, especially this last 6 months or so. And so they effectively are a coalition. I mean, one can say that North Korea is not communist. I mean, they're totalitarians, but they're not necessarily communists. The Iranians, God knows what they are, but they're probably not communists. But the Chinese are communists, and so I'm not sure that you could use the communist label, but they are hardline states. Leaders of all of them see their interests coincide. They're coordinating their policies. Their militaries are regularly exercising together. So in effect, they do form a coalition. And people call them all sorts of names, but the point is they actually see themselves as a front against the United States.
Thank you.
All right, one more question.
Here.
Yes, sir.
Dollar versus bricks.
Here you go.
I'll do these.
You got it?
Here, Larry.
Oh, where?
Address the infiltration of the Chinese communists into the American educational system, particularly the universities, and what we can do about it.
Yeah, what we can do about it. We saw all of after the October 7th attack, we saw all of these pro-Palestinian demonstrations throughout American campuses. There are a number of reasons for that, but the one that I focus on, just because I look at China, is that Chinese own TikTok, if you look at the Hamas videos, 96.5% of them support the terrorist group. And that shows you that Beijing has been using that mobile sharing app really to propagate its narratives. That's not the entire reason, of course, for it, but we have allowed basically China to become extremely influential in American campuses. They do that through the Confucius Institutes. They do that through large donations through Chinese individuals. And they do that in all sorts of ways. And we could stop them from doing it. When Betsy DeVos was education secretary in the first Trump administration, she actually went after the large Ivy League schools for violating the Federal Education Act by not reporting contributions from foreign sources of $250,000 or more. So these are the things we can do. I think that what we should be doing is lowering that $250,000 threshold down to something like $10,000 or something. And we should be getting at every Confucius Institute off of our colleges and universities. We should be getting Confucius classrooms out of our secondary schools. And one other thing, and that is we have had at its height something like 390,000 Chinese nationals in our college and university campuses. We have allowed Chinese consular officials and Ministry of State Security agents to surveil those students, so they did not actually have the full experience of being in the US. They basically made sure that Chinese students stayed by themselves, didn't interact with others. They just reported on each other. This is our country. If we want to have Chinese students here, what we need to do is make sure that they actually come here and they experience what it's like to be in America. We didn't allow that. We just let them come here and pay tuition, and we thought that was enough. It's obviously not enough, because we have allowed, as I was talking about before, the Chinese government to operate on our soil in ways which are both violating our sovereignty and criminal. So we've got to stop that. These are things that we can do. Not easy, but obviously the Chinese have gotten their way and they think they can do whatever they want, and we have to disabuse them of that right away.
One last
Just briefly, the outlook for the dollar versus the BRICS, now with Trump coming in, so.
I worry a lot about China, but I don't worry about the BRICS currency. And the reason is, for a currency to be effective, it's got to have common financial management. The euro, which the Eurozone nations they resemble each other, but they're having problems because they don't have that common financial management. Fortunately for the euro, they've got one country, Germany, that's propped the thing up. But when you think about the BRICS now it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus 4 others. These countries don't have very much in common. And what's even more interesting is that India is determined to prevent China and Russia from using the BRICS grouping to become anti-Western, anti-US. So I don't worry about a BRICS currency. There's only one country that can tank the dollar, and that, of course, is us, by overspending. So go out and support Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in their efforts to cut down debt.
Doge. So grateful, that was the last question. We want to leave time for the book signing, so I invite you all to go to the back of the room there on our left.
I don't want a job. I only got one boss. One boss is enough.